The city always had a way of chewing people up and spitting them out, leaving behind nothing but shadows and regrets. In a world of smoky bars, whispered threats, and alleyways that promised trouble, you learned quick that no one was clean, that everyone had something to lose. This was Nick Cairo's world, a labyrinth of lies and double crosses, where love was just another con and trust was the sharpest blade in the drawer. It started with a name, Vesper Lynn. She was the kind of woman you didn't forget, no matter how hard you tried. A beauty with a mind like a steel trap and a heart as cold as the diamonds she wore. She didn't just play the game, she made the rules. And when Nick Cairo fell into her orbit, he didn't realize he'd just become her next move. But Vesper wasn't the only one with secrets. There was Iris Gray, a woman too good for the world she stumbled into. Killer Kane, a hitman with a taste for violence. And Dollface, a wildcard in heels with a smile that could cut glass. Each of them had their part to play in a story that started with love and ended in blood. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a slow burn to disaster where every corner hid a betrayal and every truth came with a price. And at the center of it all was Nick Cairo, a man trying to piece together a puzzle he never asked for before it destroyed him. Because in a city like this, there were no heroes, only survivors. Before we dive into the dark twists and turns of tonight's story, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for watching and supporting X by X Confessions. Your love for these gritty tales and chilling mysteries keeps this channel alive, and I couldn't do it without you. Now let me ask you something. If you found yourself in Nick Cairo's shoes, staring down a web of betrayal, murder, and double crosses, what would you do? Let me know in the comments. I'm dying to hear your take. And hey, if you're loving these stories, smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Hit the bell icon too, so you'll be the first to know when our next confession drops. The city's full of secrets, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for being part of the X by X Confessions family. Now, let's get into it. Crafted in the world of hard-boiled noir. The night Vesper Lynn met Nick Cairo, the city of Los Angeles was sweating through its shirt. A fog of smog and desperation hung low over the skyline, the kind of night where the neon signs hummed like broken promises, and every shadow seemed to have its own agenda. She walked into the joint, a swanky party in the hills where the drinks were cold, the talk was cheap, and the guests were a little too rich for their own good. Vesper was trouble in a dress that fit like sin. She had the kind of beauty that didn't scream for attention, but whispered promises you'd regret chasing. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she slid through the crowd, all polished confidence and silent calculation. She wasn't here to mingle. She was hunting. Nick Cairo was leaning against the bar, cradling a tumbler of bourbon like it was his last friend in the world. He had the kind of face that made women want to believe his lies, a jaw carved out of ambition, and eyes that saw everything and nothing all at once. A plastic surgeon with a reputation as smooth as the scars he erased, Cairo was a man who lived in the grey, and tonight, he looked like he belonged there. Vesper clocked him immediately. She always had an eye for men who thought they were players. They didn't know the game until she was dealing the cards. He laughed, the kind of laugh that came easy when you were used to getting your way, and she decided right then and there she'd have him before the night was over. She sidled up to the bar, close enough to catch his scent. Whiskey, cologne, and just a hint of danger. "Looks like a guy like you's got no business at a party like this," she said, her voice as smooth as silk but with just enough edge to make him look twice. He turned to her, raising an eyebrow like she was the most interesting thing he'd seen all night. "A guy like me? What kind is that?" She shrugged, playing it coy. "Too sharp for this crowd. You look like someone who knows what he wants." Nick smirked, a flicker of arrogance flashing in his smile. "Maybe I do, and maybe I don't mind when it finds me first." It wasn't love, not even close. But Vesper didn't believe in love, not in the way most people did. To her, it was just another card in the deck, a tool to use, a weapon to wield. And Nick Cairo, he wasn't the endgame, he was the opening move. By the time the night was over, she had his number, his attention, and a bead on the life he could offer. He was the kind of man who collected women like trophies, and she'd make damn sure she was the shiniest one on his shelf. But Nick had no idea what kind of woman he'd just let into his world. Vesper Lynn didn't play for keeps. She played to win, no matter the cost. In the smoky haze of that party, with glasses clinking and laughter echoing off the walls, the wheels of something dark began to turn. A game of betrayal and blood, where the stakes were high and every move came with a price. And for Vesper, the price was always worth it. For almost 3 years, Vesper Lynn and Nick Cairo played at love like it was a high-stakes poker game, each holding their cards close to their chest. When they met, it was a whirlwind. Late nights that bled into mornings, promises whispered over half-empty glasses of wine, and plans for a future that neither of them truly understood. Nick swept Vesper off her feet with his charm, his success, and his effortless way of making her feel like she belonged in a world she'd only ever dreamed of. For a girl who had always been on the outside looking in, being with Nick felt like finally stepping through the velvet ropes. but the glitz started to tarnish. Nick was the kind of man who liked the chase more than the catch, and once the initial fire burned out, his attention began to wander. Vesper noticed the small things first, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the way he started answering his phone in the other room. She ignored it, convincing herself that what they had was too good to fall apart. She clung tighter, and Nick, true to form, started pulling away. The cracks in their relationship were subtle at first. Nick loved being the center of attention, and Vesper was happy to let him have the spotlight. She supported him, encouraged him, even made excuses for him when his flaws became too obvious to ignore. But beneath the surface, a quiet desperation was growing. Vesper wanted more. Marriage, a family, a life together that felt solid and unshakable. Nick? He wanted freedom, the kind of freedom that didn't come with strings or expectations. Their fights were never loud or dramatic. Nick had a way of deflecting arguments with a slick grin and a half-hearted apology, and Vesper had a way of letting him. But each unresolved conflict left a bruise, and over time the relationship became a balancing act. Her trying to hold on, him trying to slip away. By the second year, Nick's wandering eye turned into wandering hands. Vesper wasn't stupid. She knew he had other women, though he was careful never to leave enough evidence to confront him outright. Instead, she doubled down, throwing herself into being the perfect partner. She cooked his favorite meals, planned his birthday parties, even helped him network with the right people. She believed, or maybe just hoped, that if she gave him everything, he'd eventually see her as indispensable. But Nick was a gambler at heart, and Vesper was just one of many bets he'd placed. He loved the thrill of new women, the excitement of the unknown, and the rush of knowing he could get away with it. To him, Vesper was safe, a fallback, a steady presence in a world he liked to keep unstable. To her, he was everything. The tipping point came one night in late summer. They were at a dinner party, the kind Nick always dragged her to when he wanted to show off. Vesper had spent hours getting ready, picking the perfect dress, the perfect shoes, the perfect smile to wear in front of his friends. But Nick spent the entire evening talking to a woman across the table, a ledgy blonde with a laugh like wind chimes. Vesper sat there, watching them flirt as though she were invisible. Something inside her cracked. When they got home, she asked him about it. Not an accusation, just a question. Who was she? Nick shrugged it off, said she was just a friend, that Vesper was overreacting. But the tone in his voice, the way he dismissed her feelings like they were an inconvenience, told her everything she needed to know. That night, for the first time, she let herself consider the possibility that Nick Cairo wasn't the man she thought he was. The breakup, when it finally came, wasn't loud or messy. Nick simply told her it wasn't working anymore, that he needed space, that maybe they were better off as friends. Vesper nodded, smiled and said she understood. But inside, she was anything but calm. Nick had taken everything she'd given and walked away like it meant nothing. And Vesper? Vesper didn't let things go, not ever. It wasn't the end of their story, not by a long shot. It was just the moment the match hit the gasoline and the fire started to burn. The breakup wasn't just the end of a love story. It was the spark that lit a powder keg. Vesper Lynn wasn't the kind of woman you left without consequences, and Nick Cairo, smooth operator that he was, should have known better. But Nick was too busy chasing the next shiny thing to notice the storm brewing behind Vesper's perfectly painted smile. It started innocently enough, a few missed calls, a text left unanswered. Vesper didn't panic, she never did. She watched, waited, and followed the trail of breadcrumbs Nick left behind. The name Iris Gray appeared in hushed whispers, social media tags, and the occasional photograph. A tall, striking brunette with a smile so dazzling it could blind you, Iris was everything Nick wanted. Beauty, brains, and a clean slate. By the time Vesper caught wind of their weekend trip to Palm Springs, it wasn't jealousy eating at her. It was fury. Nick was parading Iris around like a prize, showing her off to his friends, his family, anyone who'd listen. The man who once promised Vesper the world was now handing it to someone else, and that wasn't something she could let slide. Vesper started making moves, the kind that didn't draw attention but left no room for error. She had connections, men who owed her favors, women who wanted to be her, and a network of shadows she could call on when things got messy. She tapped into all of it, piecing together every detail about Iris Gray. Where she worked, where she lived, what time she left her apartment every morning. Vesper wasn't planning to strike yet, just laying the groundwork for something that would leave Nick Cairo wishing he'd never crossed her. But Nick wasn't entirely innocent in this game. He knew Vesper was still hovering at the edges of his life, her presence like smoke in a closed room. He ignored it, chalking her up to a harmless ex who couldn't let go. What he didn't see was the knife she'd been sharpening behind her back, waiting for the perfect moment to sink it in. Meanwhile, Iris Gray was blissfully unaware of the war being waged in her name. To her, Nick was a charming, successful man who made her feel like the only woman in the world. She didn't see the cracks in his polished veneer, the lies he told so easily, they might as well have been truths. And she certainly didn't see Vesper coming, her designer heels clicking ever closer like the drumbeat of an approaching storm. The thing about Vesper was she didn't just want to win, she wanted everyone else to lose. And as she sat in her high-rise apartment, staring out at the city lights with a glass of scotch in one hand and a cigarette in the other, she decided that Iris Grey wasn't just an obstacle. She was a target. The game had shifted and the players were on the board, but Vesper wasn't playing for fun, she was playing for keeps. By the time Iris Grey entered the picture, Vesper Lynn had perfected the art of hiding her rage behind a practiced smile. She watched from the shadows as Nick Cairo paraded his new prize through the city. The art galleries, the upscale restaurants, the high-rise penthouses where every room came with a view and a side of whispers. Iris was everything Vesper wasn't. Elegant but approachable, radiant in a way that didn't seem rehearsed, and most of all, unbroken. She didn't see the cracks in Nick's charm or the jagged edges hiding beneath his polished exterior. But Vesper did. She always had. Iris Grey wasn't the villain in Vesper's story. She was collateral damage. The months after the breakup turned Vesper into something sharper, colder. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even try to win Nick back. Instead, she bided her time, stalking the edges of his life like a predator waiting for its prey to drop its guard. She learned everything about Iris, where she worked, where she lived, who her friends were. It wasn't hard. People like Iris left trails behind them, little breadcrumbs for someone like Vesper to follow. And Vesper followed every single one. But this wasn't a one-woman operation. Vesper knew how to delegate when it suited her. That's when Dollface came into the picture. On the surface, Dollface was just another pretty face, a glamorous girl with a crooked smile and a taste for danger. But underneath the makeup and the stilettos was a woman with her own agenda, someone who didn't ask too many questions as long as the pay was right. Vesper found her at a dive bar downtown, the kind of place where the jukebox was always broken and everyone had something to hide. "You need a driver," Dollface said, stirring her drink with a manicured finger. Her voice was smooth with just a hint of mischief. "I'm your girl." Vesper leaned in, her eyes glinting like steel under the flickering neon light. "This isn't just about driving. I need someone who can keep their mouth shut." Dollface grinned. "Honey, I don't talk unless there's something worth saying." The deal was struck. Dollface would be Vesper's eyes, her ears, and when the time came, her getaway plan. Together, they started putting the pieces in place, a puzzle of revenge that was as calculated as it was cruel. But there was one more piece Vesper needed, someone to pull the trigger. That's when Killer Kane entered the frame. He wasn't hard to find. Men like him rarely were. His reputation preceded him, a man with no conscience and an even quicker temper. He liked his drink strong, his women dangerous, and his work messy. Kane wasn't the type to play nice, but he didn't need to. Vesper didn't want nice. She wanted efficient. She found him at a pool hall on the east side, leaning against the wall like he owned the place. His leather jacket was cracked and worn, his knuckles scarred from too many fights that ended with someone else on the floor. "You Kane?" Vesper asked, stepping into his line of sight. He didn't look up, just took a drag from his cigarette. "Depends. Who's asking? Someone with a job." She dropped an envelope on the table in front of him. It was thick, the kind of envelope that spoke louder than words. Kane glanced at it, then at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "What's the catch?" he asked, tapping the ash from his cigarette onto the floor. "No catch," Vesper said. "Just a target." Kane took the envelope, flipping through the cash inside. "All right, lady. Who's the unlucky bastard?" Vesper smiled, a small, dangerous curve of her lips. "Her name's Iris Grey." It was a lie, of course. Iris wasn't the real target. She was just the bait. The real prize was Nick Cairo, and Vesper wouldn't stop until she had him exactly where she wanted him, alone, ruined, and begging for mercy he wouldn't get. The plan was in motion, a dark symphony of betrayal, greed, and revenge. And as Vesper watched the city lights flicker from her penthouse window, she felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. The game wasn't over. It was just getting started. The night it all went down, the city seemed to hold its breath. The streets were slick with rain, their reflections bending the neon signs into jagged streaks of color that made everything look just a little off-kilter. It was the kind of night where even the shadows seemed to be hiding something. And in a quiet parking garage on the west side of town, a plan 3 months in the making finally reached its crescendo. Iris Grey didn't know she was walking into a trap. That was the beauty of Vesper Lynn's scheme. Every piece had been placed so carefully, so deliberately, that by the time the noose tightened, no one would see it coming. Iris stepped out of her car, her heels clicking against the concrete as she headed toward the elevator. She was coming off another perfect date with Nick Cairo, her cheeks still flushed from the wine and laughter they'd shared at some rooftop bar he'd chosen to impress her. To Iris, it was just another night. To Vesper, it was the finale. Dollface was already in position, leaning against the driver's seat of a black sedan parked near the exit. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her lips were painted the same shade of red as the taillights glowing in the dark. She checked her watch, then glanced in the rearview mirror at Killer Kane, who was sitting in the back seat, calmly loading a revolver. "You sure about this?" Dollface asked, her voice low and steady. She wasn't nervous. Dollface didn't get nervous. But there was something about this job that felt personal, and personal jobs had a way of getting messy. Kane didn't look up, just spun the cylinder of the gun with a flick of his wrist. "She's paying, isn't she? That's all I care about." "She's always paying," Dollface muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Meanwhile, Vesper was watching from the shadows, perched in her car with the engine idling and a cigarette dangling from her fingers. She wasn't the type to get her hands dirty. She preferred to orchestrate, to control the chaos from a distance. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wanted to see it for herself. Not just the fall of Iris Grey, but the beginning of Nick Cairo's unraveling. Because this wasn't just about Iris. It was about sending a message. To Nick. To anyone who thought they could walk away from Vesper Lynn unscathed. Iris didn't notice the figure stepping out of the shadows until it was too late. Kane moved like a predator, his footsteps owing off the walls as he approached her. She turned, startled, and her eyes widened as she saw the glint of the gun in his hand. "Please," was all she managed to say before the shot rang out, sharp and final. The sound bounced off the concrete, louder than Vesper had expected. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind that wraps around you like a shroud. Then the sound of Dollface revving the engine cut through the stillness. Kane climbed back into the car without a word, his face unreadable as he wiped the gun on a handkerchief and slid it into his pocket. Dollface peeled out of the garage, her tires screeching as they disappeared into the night. From her vantage point, Vesper exhaled a plume of smoke and smiled. It was done. Iris Grey was out of the picture, and Nick Cairo was about to lose the one thing he thought he couldn't live without. But Vesper wasn't finished, not by a long shot. This was just the opening act in a play that would leave Nick broken, battered, and begging for mercy. As she drove away, the city stretched out before her like a maze of lies and secrets, each corner hiding another piece of the puzzle. Vesper knew the game wasn't over yet. The real challenge would come when Nick realized what had been taken from him and who had taken it. But for now, she let herself enjoy the moment, her fingers drumming on the steering wheel to the rhythm of her triumph. The night had claimed its victim, but the story was far from over. In Vesper Lynn's world, no one got out clean. And Nick Cairo was about to find out just how dirty things could get. Nick Cairo didn't know something was wrong until it was too late. He was pouring himself a drink when the phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet of his apartment. He let it ring twice, then 3 times, debating whether to pick up. Calls late at night were rarely good news, but something made him reach for it anyway, a sense of unease curling in his gut like smoke from a cigarette left too long in the ashtray. "Mr. Cairo?" The voice on the other end was clipped and professional, but Cairo could hear the weight behind it. "This is Detective Langley. I'm afraid I have some bad news." The words came slow, deliberate, each one a hammer blow. Iris Grey, dead, shot in the parking garage of her building. Cairo dropped the glass he'd been holding, the amber liquid spilling out like the blood he could now see in his mind. He didn't hear much of what came next. Something about an investigation, a follow-up interview, a perfunctory apology. None of it mattered. All he could think about was Iris, the way her laugh had lit up the room just hours ago, and now, nothing. He sat there in the dark, the phone still in his hand, when the pieces started to shift in his mind. Iris's death wasn't random. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong or some lunatic off the street. This had Vesper Lynn's fingerprints all over it. He didn't have proof, not yet, but he didn't need it. Vesper had always had a way of making her presence felt, even when she wasn't in the room. And right now, he could feel her everywhere. Meanwhile, Vesper was celebrating. Not in the champagne and confetti kind of way, but in her own quiet, calculated manner. She sat in her penthouse, the city sprawling out beneath her like a kingdom she intended to conquer. On the table in front of her was a single photograph, Nick and Iris, arms around each other, smiling as if nothing in the world could touch them. Vesper traced the edge of the photo with one manicured nail, then lit it on fire, watching the flames consume the image piece by piece. Nick Cairo wasn't a fool, though. He knew this wasn't just about Iris. Vesper's moves were never just moves, they were messages. And the message was clear. He was next. But Cairo wasn't the type to go quietly. He spent the next few days putting out feelers, calling in favors, and turning over every stone he could find. Somewhere out there, someone had seen something. Someone had heard something. All he needed was a thread to pull, and the whole tapestry would start to unravel. It didn't take long. The streets have a way of whispering to those who know how to listen, and Cairo had been playing this game long enough to hear their secrets. A name surfaced, Dollface. He remembered her from a party months ago, hanging on Vesper's every word like a moth to a flame. If anyone knew what had gone down in that parking garage, it was her. Tracking her down wasn't hard. Dollface had a way of leaving a trail, flashy cars, expensive drinks, and men who thought they could handle her. Cairo found her in a dimly lit club on the edge of town, sitting in a booth with a cigarette in one hand and a cocktail in the other. She looked as he approached, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she wasn't surprised. Well, she said, leaning back in her seat. If it isn't Nick Cairo, to what do I owe the pleasure? I think you know, Cairo replied, sliding into the booth across from her. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. Iris Gray, what happened? Dollface smirked, a small, dangerous curve of her lips. That's a question for your ex. I just drive the car. Funny, Cairo said, leaning closer. I don't think the cops are going to find it so funny when they hear your name, or Kane's. The mention of Killer Kane wiped the smirk off her face. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. You're playing with fire, Cairo. You think you're the only one Vesper's got her eye on? She's 10 steps ahead of you, and by the time you figure out her next move, you'll be in the ground. Cairo didn't flinch. He'd heard threats before, and this one didn't scare him. But it did confirm one thing. Vesper wasn't done with him yet. And if she thought she could finish what she'd started, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The game was on, and this time, Cairo wasn't playing defense. He was going to take the fight to Vesper, even if it meant losing everything in the process. Because Iris's death wasn't just a loss, it was a debt, and Cairo intended to collect. The air inside the interrogation room was thick with tension and stale cigarettes. Nick Cairo leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his face a study in defiance. Across from him sat Detective Langley, a wiry man with sharp eyes that seemed to cut through Cairo's practiced calm. Between them was a table cluttered with photographs, a notepad and a tape recorder that hummed faintly in the silence. You've got a lot of enemies, Cairo, Langley said, lighting another cigarette. But this one feels personal. Care to explain? Nick didn't answer right away. He let Langley's words hang in the air like smoke curling toward the flickering fluorescent lights. Iris Gray didn't have enemies, he said finally, his voice low but steady. She didn't live in that world. Maybe not, Langley said, exhaling a plume of smoke. But you do, and someone made damn sure to drag her into it. Nick's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. He'd been around cops enough to know their tricks. Langley wasn't looking for answers, he was looking for cracks. And Nick Cairo didn't crack. Not easily anyway. Who do you think did it? Langley pressed. Your ex? Vesper Lynn? Seems like her style. Nick smirked, but there was no humor in it. Vesper doesn't have a style. She has a method. And yeah, this has her fingerprints all over it. But you already knew that, didn't you? Langley didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said plenty. They had their suspicions about Vesper, but suspicions weren't enough. Not for someone like her. Vesper Lynn was untouchable. A ghost who never left behind anything as incriminating as evidence. Nick knew that better than anyone. He also knew that if he wanted justice for Iris, he'd have to find a way to drag Vesper out of the shadows and into the light. Across town, Vesper was doing what she always did best, staying one step ahead. She stood in her penthouse, gazing out at the city below, a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. On the screen was a single text message. It's done. Killer Kane was nothing, if not reliable. She didn't need details. She didn't want them. All she cared about was the fact that Iris Gray was gone and Nick Cairo was left twisting in the wind. But even as she sipped her wine, a flicker of unease crept into her mind. Nick was many things, a liar, a cheat, a fool. But he wasn't the kind of man to roll over and accept defeat. He'd come for her eventually. They always did. And when he did, she'd be ready. Vesper's preparations were meticulous. She knew the value of alliances, and she knew how to buy loyalty with money, secrets, or fear. Dollface was already running interference, feeding false leads to anyone nosy enough to start asking questions. And Kane? He was keeping his head down, waiting for the heat to die off before he moved on to his next job. But Vesper wasn't naive. The walls were closing in, and she could feel it. What she didn't expect was the knock on her door. It was late, too late for visitors, but Vesper wasn't easily rattled. She set her glass down, smoothed her dress, and opened the door to find Nick Cairo standing there, his face shadowed by the dim light of the hallway. Nick, she said, her voice a mix of surprise and amusement. What a pleasant surprise. Cut the act, Vesper, he said, stepping into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. His tone was sharp, his movements deliberate. We need to talk. About what? She asked, closing the door behind him. Iris, or the fact that you think you're clever enough to scare me? Nick didn't respond right away. He moved to the center of the room, his eyes scanning the space as if looking for something, anything that might give him an edge. You think you've won, he said finally, turning to face her. But you don't understand something, Vesper. I'm not like the others. I don't just walk away. Vesper smiled, a slow, calculating smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. No, you don't. And that's why you're still alive, for now. The tension in the room crackled like a live wire. They stood there, two players in a deadly game, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Nick knew he was outmatched. Vesper had money, power, and a web of connections that made her untouchable. But what she didn't have was something Nick had in spades, desperation. and desperation could make a man dangerous. "You're going to slip," Nick said, his voice steady but laced with quiet menace. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. And when you do, I'll be there." Vesper didn't flinch. She stepped closer, close enough that Nick could see the faint glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. "I don't slip, darling. I plan. And you? You're just a loose end I haven't decided how to tie up yet." Nick held her gaze, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to hit her, to scream, to drag her down with him into the abyss she'd created. But he knew better. Vesper Lynn wasn't someone you fought head-on. She was someone you outmaneuvered. And if he wanted to survive this, he'd have to think like her. For now, he turned and walked out, the weight of the encounter settling heavy on his shoulders. He didn't have a plan yet, but he had something better, a reason. And in a city like this, a reason could be the most dangerous weapon of all. The city was a restless animal that night, its neon eyes blinking through a haze of smog and rain. Nick Cairo moved through the streets like a shadow, his mind spinning with every angle, every possibility. Vesper Lynn had turned his world upside down, and now it was time to return the favor. The problem was, she was smarter, richer, and deadlier than anyone he'd ever tangled with. But Nick wasn't afraid of a losing fight. He'd been losing his whole life. The plan was simple: find the weak link. For all of Vesper's poise and power, even she needed people to do her dirty work. Killer Kane and Dollface were the two names on the tip of every whisper he'd heard. Kane was a ghost, impossible to pin down, but Dollface? She had a taste for attention that made her easier to track. Nick caught up to her at a poker game in a downtown speakeasy, the kind of place where the drinks were stiff and the clientele stiffer. She was seated at a corner table, leaning back with a cigarette between her fingers and a stack of chips in front of her. When she saw him, her lips curled into a sly smile. "Cairo," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You just can't stay away, can you?" Nick slid into the seat across from her, his expression unreadable. "I need answers, Dollface, and you're going to give them to me." She laughed, the sound low and smoky. "What makes you think I know anything worth telling?" "You were there the night Iris Gray died," Nick said, his voice sharp as a blade. "You drove the car. You saw what happened." The laughter faded, but her smile remained. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Cairo. I'm just a driver. I don't ask questions and I don't give answers." Nick leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "You think Vesper's going to protect you? You're nothing to her. Just another pawn in her game. When the heat comes down, she'll let you burn." For a moment, Dollface didn't say anything. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to Nick. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" she said quietly. "You think you're the hero in this story. But let me tell you something, Cairo. There are no heroes in Vesper Lynn's world, only survivors." Nick didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, one of Iris, smiling and carefree. He placed it on the table between them. "She didn't deserve this," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You can keep playing Vesper's game, or you can do something right for once in your life. Your call." Dollface stared at the photo, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Nick thought he saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She snuffed out her cigarette, then leaned back in her chair. "You're playing a dangerous game, Cairo," she said. "But you're right about one thing. I'm not going down for her." She reached into her purse and slid a piece of paper across the table. "That's where you'll find Kane. He's the one you want, not me." Nick picked up the paper, his heart pounding as he read the address scrawled on it. He didn't thank her. There was no point. Dollface wasn't helping him out of the goodness of her heart. She was just cutting her losses. But it didn't matter. He finally had a lead, and that was enough. Meanwhile, Vesper Lynn was already tightening the noose. She sat in her office, a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. A message from Kane flashed on the screen. "Cairo's getting close." Vesper smiled, a cold, calculated smile. Nick Cairo thought he was hunting her, but he didn't realize he was walking straight into her trap. She'd let him play his little game, let him think he had the upper hand. But when the time was right, she'd make her move. And when she did, there'd be no one left to save him. The chessboard was set, the pieces in motion. And in this game, Vesper always won. Nick Cairo pulled up to the address Dollface had given him, a crumbling warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The place reeked of trouble. Rusted metal and broken glass littered the lot, and the only light came from a flickering street lamp that cast jagged shadows across the ground. It was the kind of spot where bad things happen to worse people, and Nick had no illusions about which category he fell into tonight. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, his hand resting on the revolver in his lap. He hadn't fired it in years, and he hoped to keep it that way. But this was Killer Kane's territory, and Kane wasn't the kind of man you approached unarmed. Nick stepped out of the car and made his way to the entrance, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the night breeze. He pushed it open, the sound of creaking metal echoing into the darkness. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint hum of machinery. "Kane!" Nick called out, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his chest. "We need to talk." For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then from the shadows a figure emerged. Killer Kane was just as Nick had imagined, broad-shouldered, with a face carved out of stone and eyes that gleamed like a predator's. He was holding a wrench in one hand, his grip casual but firm, like he was deciding whether to use it. "You've got guts showing up here, Cairo," Kane said, his voice low and gravelly, "but I'm guessing you're short on brains." "I'm here for answers," Nick replied, meeting Kane's gaze. "What happened to Iris Gray?" Kane chuckled, a sound that was more menacing than amused. "You're asking the wrong guy. I just do the jobs. I don't write the scripts." "You pulled the trigger," Nick said, his tone sharp. "That makes you responsible." Kane stepped closer, his expression hardening. "You think you're some kind of Avenger, Cairo? Some knight in shining armor out to save the day? Hate to break it to you, but you're just another piece on Vesper's board, and she's playing a game you can't win." Nick clenched his fists, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Maybe, but you don't have to be her pawn. Help me bring her down." Kane tilted his head, studying Nick like a cat watching a mouse. For a moment it looked like he might actually consider it, but then he shook his head, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You don't get it, do you? Vesper doesn't lose. She doesn't allow it." Before Nick could respond, a sharp noise cut through the air, a car door slamming outside. Kane's expression darkened. "Looks like the boss lady's here," he muttered. Nick turned toward the door just as Vesper Lynn stepped inside, her silhouette framed by the dim light from the lock. She was dressed in black, her heels clicking against the concrete floor as she approached. In her hand was a pistol, sleek and elegant, much like the woman holding it. "Nick," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I have to admit, I didn't think you'd make it this far. I'm almost impressed." "Vesper," Nick said, his voice laced with contempt. "I should have known you'd show up to tie up loose ends." She smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "Of course, I can't have you ruining my plans. You've always been good at creating problems, but this time, I'm afraid you've overplayed your hand." Nick glanced at Kane, hoping for an ally, but the hitman just crossed his arms and leaned against a pillar, clearly uninterested in getting between them. "Don't do this, Vesper," Nick said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "You've already won. Let it go." "Won?" Vesper raised an eyebrow, her pistol leveling at him. "You think this is about winning? This is about survival, Nick, and in my world there's no room for sentiment." Nick's mind raced. He could see only one way out, but it wasn't going to be pretty. His hand inched toward the revolver at his side, but Vesper caught the movement. "Don't," she warned, her tone icy. "You won't make it." But Nick didn't have a choice. He moved fast, drawing his gun and diving behind a stack of crates as Vesper's shot rang out, the sound reverberating through the warehouse. Kane cursed and ducked for cover, clearly uninterested in taking a bullet for anyone. The room erupted into chaos. Vesper's heels clicked as she moved, her shots deliberate but missing their mark. Nick returned fire, his adrenaline pumping as he tried to maneuver around the crates. He needed an edge, something to turn the tide. And then he saw it, a control panel on the far wall, the kind that could shut off the lights. He made a break for it, dodging another shot from Vesper. His shoulder slammed against the panel, and with a flick of a switch, the warehouse plunged into darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Vesper's voice cut through the blackness, sharp and mocking. "You can't hide forever, Nick. I always find what I'm looking for." Nick didn't answer. He moved quietly, using the darkness to his advantage. He could feel the tension in the air, the deadly game of cat and mouse playing out in real time. And for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was he. The darkness of the warehouse was like a second skin, clinging to Nick Cairo as he moved silently between the stacks of crates and rusting machinery. His breaths came shallow and quick, his pulse hammering in his ears. Vesper Lynn was out there, somewhere, a shadow with a gun and a grudge. Every step he took felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of knives. "You're wasting time, Nick." Vesper's voice echoed through the space, her tone dripping with amusement. "You always were predictable, playing the hero, trying to save a world that doesn't need saving." Nick didn't respond. He needed to stay focused. The warehouse was a labyrinth, and in the pitch black it felt like the walls were closing in. His fingers tightened around the grip of his revolver. He had one shot at this, literally, and it had to count. Killer Kane, meanwhile, was somewhere in the mix, lurking like the predator he was. Nick could hear the faint scuffle of boots on concrete, the sound sending a chill down his spine. Kane didn't care who came out on top. He was in it for the thrill, the money, or both. And Nick knew better than to trust a man like that to sit this one out. Then, there it was, a flash of movement in the corner of his eye. Nick turned and fired, the shot exploding like a firecracker in the stillness. It hit nothing but air, the sound ricocheting off the walls and masking the sharp click of Vesper's heels as she shifted her position. "Missed me," she called, her voice sharp and taunting. "You're out of practice, Nick. Maybe you should have stayed in my shadow where you belong." Nick bit back a curse and kept moving. He needed a plan, but the only thing coming to him was survival instinct. He crouched low behind a crate, his ears straining for the slightest sound. Vesper was close, too close. He could feel her presence like a blade at his back. And then the lights came back on. It was Kane. He stood by the control panel, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "Thought I'd make it more interesting," he said, his voice a low rumble. The sudden brightness blinded Nick for a split second, and that was all it took. Vesper stepped into view, her pistol trained on him, her expression a mix of triumph and fury. She looked like a goddess of vengeance, her silhouette framed by the harsh industrial light. "It's over, Nick," she said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "You should have stayed down." But just as she pulled the trigger, a deafening crash echoed through the warehouse. Dollface. She'd slammed her car through one of the loading bay doors, the vehicle screeching to a halt between Vesper and Nick. The distraction was enough for Nick to dive behind another crate. The bullet meant for him shattering a metal pipe instead. Dollface stepped out of the car, her face set in a grim line. "You're losing your touch, Vesper," she said, pulling a pistol of her own. "You don't leave loose ends." "Dollface," Vesper hissed, her gun now pointed at the newcomer. "You traitorous little." But before she could finish, Kane stepped in, his deep laugh cutting through the tension. Ladies, let's not get messy now." The standoff was electric. Vesper, Dollface, and Kane all had their weapons drawn, their loyalties shifting like sand under a storm. And Nick, he used the chaos to slip around the perimeter, positioning himself behind a stack of crab crates where he had a clear line of sight. "Enough." Vesper's voice cracked like a whip, her gun swinging back to Nick. "This ends now." Nick stepped out of the shadows, his revolver raised and steady. "You're right," he said, his voice cold. "It does." For a moment, everything froze. The air was thick with the promise of violence, the kind that leaves no survivors. And then the first shot rang out. It was Dollface. She fired at Kane, the bullet grazing his shoulder and sending him reeling. Vesper spun toward the sound, giving Nick the opening he needed. He fired once, the shot hitting Vesper's gun hand and sending the weapon clattering to the floor. She cried out, clutching her hand, but her eyes burned with defiance. Kane, bleeding but furious, lunged for Dollface, his knife flashing in the light. She sidestepped, her gun trained on him, but the fight was far from over. Nick advanced on Vesper, his gun still raised. "It's over, Vesper. You've lost." She laughed, low and bitter, her eyes glinting like shards of broken glass. "Lost? You think this is about winning, Nick? I'll be back. I always come back." But Nick shook his head. "Not this time." Behind him, Dollface managed to knock Kane unconscious with the butt of her pistol, the hitman collapsing in a heap. She turned to Nick, her face pale but resolute. "What now?" "Now," Nick said, his voice grim. "We call the cops." Vesper's expression shifted, panic flickering in her eyes for the first time. "You wouldn't dare." Nick's smile was cold as he reached for his phone. "Watch me." The police arrived 20 minutes later, sirens slicing through the stillness of the warehouse district. Nick Cairo stood near the broken loading bay door, the revolver still warm in his hand. Dollface leaned against her car, her face a mix of exhaustion and defiance, while Killer Kane groaned from the floor, his shoulder bleeding but his pride wounded worse. Vesper Lynn sat on a crate, her face pale but her eyes sharp, like a blade that hadn't lost its edge. Her injured hand was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, and despite the situation, she still managed to look composed, regal even. The queen of a kingdom built on lies, watching her empire crumble. When Detective Langley stepped into the scene, his sharp gaze swept over the chaos before landing on Nick. "Well, Cairo," he said, his tone as dry as the air after a rainstorm. "Looks like you've been busy." Nick didn't respond right away. He handed Langley his revolver, handle first, and took a step back. "I'll save you the trouble of piecing it together. Vesper Lynn orchestrated the murder of Iris Gray. Kane pulled the trigger. Dollface drove the car." Langley raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a half smile. "Convenient how you managed to wrap it all up in a bow. You leave anything out?" "Yeah," Nick said, his voice flat. "The part where I should have stopped this before it ever started." Langley let the words hang in the air for a moment before motioning to the officers behind him. They moved in swiftly, cuffing Kane first, who grumbled something about bad timing before turning to Dollface. She didn't resist, but her eyes lingered on Nick as the cuffs clicked into place. "You're really handing me over?" she asked, her voice quiet but cutting. "After everything?" Nick met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You made your choices, Dollface. We all did." Then they came for Vesper. She didn't flinch as they pulled her to her feet, her injured hand still clutched protectively against her chest. Her eyes locked on Nick's, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. "You think this changes anything?" she said, her voice low and venomous. "You think the world's going to thank you for playing the hero? You're just a fool, Nick. A fool who thinks he can win a game that's already over." Nick didn't reply. He just watched as they led her away, her heels clicking against the concrete one last time. She didn't look back. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, police reports, and statements that felt like they belonged to someone else. Nick gave Langley everything he had, every detail he'd pieced together over the last few months. The detective listened, his expression neutral, but Nick could tell he wasn't buying all of it. Langley was the kind of guy who knew there was always more to a story than what was written on the page. When the dust finally settled, Nick found himself back in his apartment, staring out the window at the city below. The skyline was dark, the lights scattered like stars that had lost their way. He poured himself a drink, the burn of the whiskey a welcome distraction from the silence. Iris Gray was gone. Nothing could change that. But Vesper Lynn's reign was over, her web of lies and deceit unraveling with every passing day. Kane would rot in a cell, Dollface would face her own reckoning, and Vesper, she'd survive. Women like her always did. But she wouldn't have the power she once held, and that was enough for now. Nick downed the rest of his drink and set the glass on the counter. The city outside pulsed with life, a reminder that the game never really ended. There was always another fight, another mystery, another Vesper Lynn waiting in the wings. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Nick felt something close to peace. He lit a cigarette and leaned against the window, the smoke curling around him like a ghost. Somewhere out there, the world kept turning. And for Nick Cairo, that was enough. The game was over, for now. Thank you so much for watching this video from X by X Confessions. If you enjoyed diving into the dark twists and turns of tonight's story, let us know by smashing that like button. We want to hear from you. What would you do if you found yourself entangled in a web of betrayal and deadly secrets like Nick Cairo? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We're eager to read your insights. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new confession. We've got plenty more thrilling tales coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Thanks again for being part of the X by X Confessions family. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and remember, sometimes the darkest secrets are the ones we keep closest.